In late October of 2001, the hills above the Harper family's grazing land were already touched by frost. The grass lay flat under the weight of a long, cold wind, and the sound of sheep bells carried far in the thin mountain air. 12-year-old Lila Harper had grown up in this landscape, the daughter of a man whose family had run sheep here for 3 generations. That afternoon, she and her father, Matthew, were bringing the flock down from higher pasture before the first real snow. It was the kind of work they'd done together countless times, where conversation came in quiet bursts between the rhythmic calls to the animals. At one point, near the shadowed line of abandoned logging cabins that dotted the slope, Matthew noticed a lamb missing from the group. It was nothing unusual. Lambs sometimes strayed, and Lila volunteered to go after it. He watched her jog toward the ridge, her small frame vanishing behind a line of willows, the back of her coat catching the last flare of sunlight. Minutes passed, then more. Matthew expected to see her reappear, a lamb tucked under her arm or coaxed along by a rope, but the ridge stayed empty, the willows unmoving. He told himself she'd looped around the other side, maybe bringing the lamb in from a better angle. By the time he'd finished tightening the flock into a pen, though, the light had shifted, and there was still no sign of her. He walked up to the ridge himself, scanning the slope below. No lamb, no Lila. The air had grown sharper, colder, and with every minute a slow unease began to settle in his chest. When he called her name, the wind seemed to take it, carrying it further than he intended, and there was no answer. At first he thought maybe she'd headed for the old trapper's cabin, one of the few with a door still on its hinges, to wait out the cold. He made his way there, boots snapping through brittle twigs, the sound of his breath loud in his ears. The cabin was empty, just as it had been for years, smelling faintly of char and dust. He stepped back outside, his voice louder this time, but the hills only gave him silence. By late afternoon, Matthew had covered the nearby draws and deer trails, his calls becoming sharper, more urgent. He tried to convince himself that she was still close, that she'd appear over the next rise with a sheep in tow and an annoyed look at all the fuss. But when the sun dipped behind the ridge, throwing the valleys into early darkness, a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Lila knew these hills. She knew where to step, how to read the land. Getting turned around was possible, but not for long. And not for her. He hurried back to the homestead, heart pounding, and called Sarah, his wife, from the porch phone. Within the hour, word had spread down the narrow dirt road into town. Trucks began arriving with headlights cutting through the dark, and neighbors stepped out in heavy coats, flashlights in hand. Some brought their own dogs. Others carried thermoses and extra batteries. They fanned out in groups, starting from the ridge where Lila was last seen, calling her name into the wind. The night air was brittle, the kind that carried sound in strange ways, and every snap of a branch made someone turn their light in that direction. But the beams revealed only frost-tipped grass, empty game trails, and the endless shadow of the tree line. Hours went by. The searchers' voices grew hoarse, their lights moving slower, sweeping over the same ground twice, 3 times. They checked the cabins, the barns, the culverts where sometimes animals sheltered. Nothing. Sometime after midnight, the sheriff arrived, setting up a small command point in the back of his SUV. He asked for a timeline, for the exact words Lila had said before she went toward the ridge. Matthew replayed it in his mind, how casual it had been, how there was no sign of hesitation or fear in her voice. Just an ordinary errand in an ordinary afternoon that had turned into something impossible. By 3 a.m., the cold had driven most of the volunteers home, but Matthew stayed out, moving slowly with a light that felt too small against the size of the hills. He followed the sheep tracks and the faint depressions in the grass where Lila's boots might have been, losing them in the rocky ground near a shallow gully. Somewhere beyond that, the land rose toward a cluster of trees, the same place hunters said deer bedded down at night, but it was empty, silent. He called her name again, softer this time, as though volume might change the answer. When the sun broke the next morning, the search began again, larger now, with fresh volunteers and deputies on horseback. The hills seemed endless in daylight, their folds and gullies multiplying with every step. People talked quietly among themselves, about mountain lions, sudden weather shifts, strangers passing through, but the words always faded when Matthew drew near. There was an unspoken understanding in towns like this. Bad things could happen anywhere, but when they happened here, they became everyone's burden. By the end of that second day, there was still no sign of Lila. No clothing, no tracks, no trace of the lamb she'd gone after. It was as if both had slipped through a tear in the land. That night, as Matthew stood on the ridge alone, the wind cut sharper than before, and he realized with a hollow certainty that something had happened beyond the ordinary. Something that could not be explained away by bad weather or an animal attack. And whatever it was, it had begun here, in these hills, in the space between a father's last sight of his daughter and the silence that followed, a silence that would come to define the next 22 years. By the morning after Lila's disappearance, the search had grown into a coordinated operation. Sheriff's deputies established a base of command near the Harper Ranch, parking cruisers and horse trailers in the dirt lot, while volunteers gathered around maps spread on the hoods of trucks. Search and rescue teams from neighboring counties arrived with trained dogs, radios, and GPS units, ready to sweep the surrounding terrain in carefully plotted grids. Even ranchers from miles away joined in, riding the fence lines and gullies on horseback, checking places where a person could slip out of sight. The hills that had once felt familiar to everyone now seemed endless, each ridge revealing two more behind it. The first real sign of hope came mid-morning when a K-9 unit picked up a scent near the ridge where Matthew had last seen his daughter. The trail led down a slope into tangled undergrowth, a deer trail choked with willow and alder. Handlers moved carefully, calling updates into their radios. The scent held steady for nearly half a mile, winding toward a cluster of derelict cabins left behind by loggers decades earlier. The path was rough, littered with fallen branches, but the dogs stayed on track, until, abruptly, they didn't. The scent ended at the threshold of an old trapper's cabin, its roof sagging, the boards warped by years of snow and sun. Inside, dust coated every surface, and a large iron stove sat cold in the corner, its once black finish now mottled with rust. The place looked untouched for years, apart from the faint smell of ash that clung to the air. Deputies photographed the interior, bagged a few scraps of fabric found near the door, and swept the area for footprints. None were fresh. The discovery was unsettling. The abrupt end of the scent trail suggested Lila had either entered the cabin and somehow left without a trace, or something had happened there that stopped her movement entirely. As hours stretched into days, theories multiplied. Some believed a mountain lion might have ambushed her on the trail, dragging her off into the brush. Others pointed out that the weather had dipped close to freezing that night. Maybe she'd gotten disoriented, wandered too far, and succumbed to exposure. But a darker theory began to circulate quietly, that a person, not nature, had taken her. This idea gained traction when deputies began revisiting locals who'd drawn suspicion in past incidents. One name surfaced again and again. Elijah Crow, a reclusive trapper known for living alone in the hills, trading pelts for supplies at odd hours and disappearing for weeks at a time. In early 2001, neighbors had complained about him inviting local kids to help with chores at his property, though nothing had ever been proven. Crow had left town abruptly that summer, reportedly headed north. His name had been in the sheriff's notes during the first hours of Lila's disappearance, but with no physical link to the case, there was little they could do. Deputies also questioned a seasonal ranch hand with a history of minor assaults and a retired miner who'd been camping alone in the area. Each denied involvement, and without evidence, each was released. Meanwhile, search teams kept combing the hills. They rappelled into ravines, scoured dry creek beds, and used metal detectors in areas where a lost button or zipper might surface. Divers checked 2 small stock ponds for any sign of clothing or remains. Every night, they returned with nothing. The absence of physical evidence, no torn fabric, no dropped flashlight, not even the lost lamb, weighed heavily on the investigators. In missing persons cases, the first 72 hours are critical, but by the end of the first week, Even the most optimistic searchers knew the odds were shifting. As the second week began, the scale of the operation started to contract. Volunteers went back to work. The horses were trailered home. The sheriff announced they were transitioning from an active search to a continuing investigation, a phrase that in small towns is often understood to mean that hope is fading. For the Harper family, this shift was devastating. Matthew remained out in the field most days, retracing routes, scanning tree lines through binoculars, his calls to Lila now softer, more like whispers to himself. Sarah stayed home, answering the phone each time it rang, bracing herself for either a lead or the worst possible news. The community, too, began to change. In the first days, there had been unity, a shared determination to bring the girl home. But as the search waned, suspicion seeped in. Neighbors watched each other more closely. People wondered aloud why certain names had been questioned by deputies and why others hadn't. Conversations in the grocery store lowered to a murmur when someone connected to the case walked past. For some, the mystery was unbearable. For others, it became easier not to speak of it at all. By the 14th day, the official search was scaled back entirely. Deputies still followed up on tips, but there were fewer of them now, and most led nowhere. The Harpers were left with an unthinkable void. No body, no evidence, no answers. Just the knowledge that somewhere in those hills, or perhaps far beyond them, the trail of their daughter's life had ended. And as Matthew stood once more near the old trapper's cabin, staring at the rusted stove, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the trail that had gone cold. It was the truth itself, buried deep in silence, waiting for years to come. By late November, the weather in the northern Montana hills had turned brutal. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and the search area that once felt like an open, breathing landscape became locked under a hard shell of ice and snow. The draws and gullies that searchers had combed for weeks were now buried, their contours erased. The creeks froze into opaque ribbons, and the wind off the ridges cut deep enough to numb exposed skin in minutes. The official search had been suspended for safety, but Matthew Harper couldn't stop. He bought a pair of snowshoes, borrowed high-grade binoculars from a neighbor, and began making solitary treks into the hills each morning. He moved methodically, scanning tree lines and ridge crests, searching for anything out of place, a piece of fabric snagged in brush, the shape of a lamb's carcass under the snow, a depression where something larger might be buried. He learned to read the winter landscape in a different way, following subtle variations in wind-blown drifts or the faint disruptions left by deer moving through. Most days he found nothing, but finding nothing didn't stop him. He returned home at dusk with his face red from cold, legs aching, and wrote down everything he'd seen in a worn notebook. Weather patterns, animal tracks, old fences fallen into disrepair. If there was a pattern to uncover, he was determined to find it. Inside the Harper home, the atmosphere was quieter, but no less strained. Sarah tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for their other two children, helping them with schoolwork, keeping the house warm, and insisting on family meals even when Matthew was late. But each trip he took into the hills left her with a heavy knot in her chest, the fear that his obsession was not only wearing him down physically, but slowly pulling him further away from them. She also bore the weight of the town's unspoken judgment. At the post office, at the feed store, in the pews at church, she could feel the eyes on her, the questions lingering just behind polite smiles. Some people wanted to know every detail of what the police had found. Others seemed to wonder if there was more to the story, something the family wasn't saying. The sheriff's office, with no new leads to chase and no physical evidence to process, began using a word Sarah hated: cold. By spring of 2002, they made it official. The disappearance of Lila Harper was now a cold case. There would be no more coordinated searches, no more dedicated deputies assigned to the file. Tips would still be followed up on, they assured the Harpers, but realistically, unless something new came in, the case would remain as it was, open but unmoving. For Matthew, this was unacceptable. He rejected the notion that Lila's case was finished in any sense. He refused to hold a memorial, refused to even consider the idea that she might be gone for good. In their home, Lila's bedroom became a kind of preserved space. Her bed remained neatly made, the comforter smoothed just as she'd left it. On the hook by the door, her winter coat still hung, sleeves slightly creased from where her arms had bent them. Sarah dusted the room quietly when no one was looking, unable to bear the thought of it becoming stale and forgotten, but she didn't move or change anything. For Matthew, the room was a kind of proof, a physical reminder that she had been there, that she could be again. He began to fill journals with theories, cross-referencing his notes from winter searches with old maps of the grazing, land and the abandoned logging camps. He marked possible sighting points, routes someone could have taken to avoid detection, and even made lists of people who had been in the area that day, noting their histories and any rumors tied to them. Some entries were neat and methodical, others, written late at night, bordered on frantic. He convinced himself that the answers were out there, just hidden in a layer he hadn't yet peeled back. Years began to pass this way, not quickly, not slowly, but in a kind of suspended state where nothing resolved and nothing truly moved forward. Birthdays came and went without celebration. The family's Christmas tree became smaller each year, the decorations fewer. The children grew older, their lives folding around the absence at the center of their family. In town, talk of the case grew less frequent, though not forgotten. It was a story people told newcomers with a shake of the head, a warning about how fast someone could vanish in the hills. For the Harpers, the ache of not knowing never dulled. Each season brought its own cruel reminder. Spring thaw revealed nothing. Summer storms rolled over empty ridges. Autumn returned them to the anniversary, and winter sealed the hills again. Time moved, but for them, it didn't carry the weight of closure, only the weight of waiting. And as Matthew stood on the porch one frigid evening in late 2003, staring at the faint outline of the ridge in the distance, he realized that the landscape no longer looked like the place he had once known. It had become something else entirely, the place where his daughter vanished, and where, somewhere in the silence, the truth was still hiding. It was the summer of 2006 when the first flicker of movement returned to a case most in town had quietly filed away in the back of their minds. A hiker passing through the ridges north of the Harper grazing land noticed something tangled in a low thicket of brush, a faded pink hair tie, stretched out and weathered by the elements. He almost left it there, but something about it stuck with him. And when he returned to town, he mentioned it to a friend who happened to know the story of Lila Harper. The sheriff's office was called, and before long, deputies were walking the ridge with the hiker, marking the spot on a GPS unit. The item was bagged and logged, its simple shape and color stirring an unease that had been dormant for years. When shown the hair tie, Sarah Harper didn't cry. She just stared at it for a long moment, turning it over in her hands. Lila had owned several like it, often worn on her wrist when she was out working with the flock. But the years had changed the material. It was frayed, stiff, stained in ways that could have come from weather or from something else entirely. Forensic testing confirmed it had likely been exposed to the elements for years, but the exact timeline was impossible to pin down. Animal activity, shifting snowpack, and seasonal. Runoff could have moved it from its original location. It was, at best, a faint trace, but for the Harpers, it was still more than they'd had in half a decade. The find was enough for the sheriff's department to reopen the case file. Detectives began contacting people who had lived in or passed through the area back in 2001, hoping that time might loosen memories or bring forward something overlooked. Many of the names were familiar from the original investigation. Some former residents now lived hours away. Others had died, their memories gone with them. One, however, agreed to meet in person, an older man who'd worked as a seasonal hunting guide that year. His account was halting at first, but then he mentioned something that made the detectives lean in. The day after Lila vanished, he said, he had been scouting deer signs near the old trappers' cabins when he noticed a thin plume of smoke curling from one of the chimneys. It caught his attention because, as far as he knew, no one had been living there in years. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Hunters sometimes used the cabins for shelter, and in late October, a fire could mean nothing more than someone staying warm. Still, hearing it again in the context of a missing child, the detail carried a different weight. Investigators moved quickly to revisit the cabins. The structures had weathered another 5 winters, their roofs sagging further, some walls bowed from snow load. Inside, the air was stale and damp, floorboards spongy with rot. The cabin the man had described as having smoke showed no obvious signs of recent habitation, at least not recent by the standards of 2006. The iron stove in the corner was coated in a dull layer of rust. A sweep with metal detectors turned up nothing but old nails and fragments of tin. Soil samples were taken from the floor in the ash pit, but preliminary analysis showed nothing conclusive. The detectives considered the possibility that whoever had been there the day after Lila vanished had cleaned up deliberately, leaving no trace. But it was also possible the smoke had come from something innocent, a lost hunter, a passing drifter, someone simply keeping warm. That ambiguity was the kind that could consume an investigation. Without more, the detail was little more than a shadow, suggestive but unprovable. Word of the reopened case rippled through the small community, stirring both hope and suspicion. For some, it was a relief to see activity again, the possibility that an answer might still be found. For others, it was an unwelcome reopening of wounds and whispers. People began remembering old suspicions, dredging up rumors that had cooled over the years. Conversations in diners circled back to the same names, the same unconfirmed sightings, the same question of whether a stranger could have passed through unnoticed. For the Harpers, the effect was more complicated. The hair tie had brought a flicker of hope, but the smoke sighting pushed that hope into darker territory. If someone had been at the cabin the day after Lila disappeared, it meant she could have been alive, at least for a time. It meant her final hours might have happened within walking distance of home. Matthew found himself returning to that thought over and over, imagining the plume of smoke against the pale autumn sky, wondering who had been tending the fire, and why. Weeks passed with no further breakthroughs. The hair tie was logged as possible evidence, but without DNA or a solid chain of possession, it was more symbolic than conclusive. The witness statement about the smoke was noted, but without corroboration, it remained a thread with nothing to tie it to. By winter, the case was quietly shifted back into inactive status. The sheriff offered the Harpers his condolences once more, promising that any new tip would be pursued. The investigation's brief revival left behind a residue of unease, heavier than before. The possibility of human involvement, of someone deliberately hiding in those hills after the disappearance, now hung over the story like a shadow that could not be chased away. And as another year closed, the unanswered question wasn't just what had happened to Lila, but who, if anyone, had stood in the cold that day, watching the smoke rise into a sky that had already swallowed her whole. By the fall of 2011, the story of Lila Harper had taken on a life of its own in the small towns and ranching communities surrounding the northern Montana hills. For people who'd lived there long enough, it was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a warning. Parents told their children not to wander too far when grazing livestock or hiking in the backcountry, invoking Lila's name the way some might mention a cliff's edge or a swollen river. Don't go near the old hills, they'd say, as if the land itself carried the danger. The phrase became shorthand for a place that could swallow you whole and never give you back. Matthew Harper had grown older in ways that went beyond the calendar. His hair, once thick and dark, had thinned and turned to a coarse gray. His face carried deep lines etched by wind, sun, and years of squinting against the distance, looking for something that never came into view. While the community had slowly folded Lila's story into its folklore, Matthew had never stepped away from the search. By now, he no longer coordinated with deputies or carried maps marked with grids. He worked alone, moving deliberately between ridges, ravines, and, always, the same cluster of abandoned cabins that had been a focal point in the earliest days. He was certain, more certain than he could ever prove, that the answer was hidden in one of those cabins. Sometimes he would sit for hours inside the old trapper's place, staring at the rusted stove, running his hands over the warped wooden floorboards, searching for anything that might have been overlooked. The deputies humored him at first, but as the years dragged on and no physical evidence emerged, they stopped answering his requests for formal searches. Without something tangible, a new tip, a credible sighting, a forensic link, they couldn't justify dedicating resources. To them, it was an open wound that had scarred over. To Matthew, it was still bleeding. Every so often, strange reports filtered in from hunters or hikers passing through the high country. Someone claimed to have found a scrap of cloth half burned in an old fire ring, its faded pattern faintly reminiscent of the shirts Lila used to wear. Another man swore he saw deep, deliberate scratches carved into the floorboards of one cabin, as if someone had tried to leave a mark before being taken away. A bow hunter said he came across boot prints inside a cabin weeks after the last snowfall, though there were no prints leading in or out. Each story made its way back to Matthew, and each one relit the same restless fire. But when deputies followed up, they dismissed the signs as unrelated, the scraps too degraded to test, the scratches likely the work of animals, the boot prints explained away by snowmelt and distortion. Over time, the hills themselves seemed to grow heavier with the weight of the story. Locals avoided them without always realizing why, choosing easier routes for grazing or hunting, staying closer to the roads. The cabins rotted a little more each year, their roofs bowing, windows falling out, but they remained standing, silent witnesses to whatever had happened a decade earlier. People who still ventured up there described an uneasy quiet, the kind that made even the sound of your own breathing feel too loud. It was as if the place remembered, even if no one could prove what it remembered. Sarah Harper, for her part, had learned to navigate a different kind of survival. She kept the household running, saw their children through school, and tried not to dwell on the image of her daughter somewhere in those hills. The absence had settled into her like an unwelcome houseguest, no longer shocking but always present. Friends and neighbors had stopped asking for updates years ago, offering instead a kind of gentle avoidance, the kindness of not forcing her to say, again, that she didn't know. For Matthew, though, avoidance was impossible. Every trip into the hills felt like a confrontation, a challenge to the silence that had taken his daughter. He carried with him an almost superstitious belief that if he kept looking, one day the land would give something back. He didn't need a complete answer anymore. He told himself even the smallest piece, a button, a hair clip, a bone, would be enough. But each time he returned empty-handed, the ground seemed to grow a little more closed, the trees a little more indifferent. By the 10th anniversary, a quiet acceptance had settled over the wider community, but it was the kind of acceptance that coexisted with unease. People could live alongside the absence, but they could not forget it entirely. The story of Lila Harper remained a shadow at the edge of their collective memory, the kind that could lengthen without warning on certain cold afternoons. And in those hills, the cabins continued to stand, weathered, empty, and to Matthew's mind, still holding on to the truth. The only question was how many more years it would remain locked away. In early 2023, the winter in the northern Montana hills was sharper than usual, the kind that could grind a man down to his bones. Snow had drifted high against fence lines, and winds came in sudden punishing bursts that stripped heat from the body in seconds. Matthew Harper, now in his 60s, still made the rounds on his grazing land, a routine he'd never abandoned. It was part necessity, part habit, and part something else, a compulsion to keep watch over the land that had taken his daughter more than 2 decades earlier. On a late afternoon in February, while checking the outermost fence line, a wall of fast-moving clouds rolled over the ridge, bringing with it a blinding squall. Visibility dropped to a few yards. The wind cut so hard it bent the tops of the willows. Matthew knew he wouldn't make it back home without shelter. The closest refuge was one of the old trapper cabins, a structure he'd entered countless times over the years, usually with the same result: dust, decay, and silence. But stepping inside this time, something felt different. The air held a faint warmth, not the biting chill he'd expected. Against one wall, a stack of split firewood sat neatly arranged, the kind of preparation no drifter or careless hunter usually bothered with. Boot prints, still crisp in the layer of dust near the doorway, led toward the stove. The iron belly of it was dull with age, but when Matthew placed his palm against the side, he felt it, not heat exactly, but the ghost of it, as if a fire had been burning there not long before. He stood still for a long moment, listening. The cabin was quiet, but his pulse had quickened. In his mind, the warmth meant one thing: someone had been here recently. And if someone had been using the cabin, then the door to every old suspicion swung wide open again. He left that day without lighting his own fire, moving quickly through the snow until the cabin was hidden behind the slope. That night, he barely slept. The image of those boot prints in the neat firewood looped in his head. Whoever had been there was organized, deliberate, not just passing through. Weeks later, when the weather cleared enough for another trip, Matthew returned. He told himself it was to check the fence again, but his path angled inevitably toward the cabin. This time, he came with the intention of staying a while, to see if anything new revealed itself. The firewood was still there, though the stack looked slightly smaller. No new prints marked the dust. The stove stood silent in the corner, its iron door shut tight. He decided to make use of it, but first he wanted to clean out whatever was inside. Opening the ash compartment, he expected to find the usual light, powdery residue left by burnt wood. Instead, the ash was dense, unusually heavy, and clumped in places. As he scooped it into a metal pail, he noticed the color was uneven. Streaks of pale gray mixed with flecks that were different from the rest. They caught the light in a way ash normally didn't. He picked one out. It was small, irregularly shaped, and hard between his fingers. Another piece, slightly curved, made him pause. Years of searching had taught him to recognize the difference between stone, wood, and something else entirely. These fragments felt brittle in a way that was deeply unsettling. He turned them over in his palm, the pale surface catching faintly in the dim light. The thought came unbidden but immediate. Bone. He couldn't say from what, or from when, but the possibility lodged itself so firmly that he could hardly breathe. He sifted through more of the ash, finding several other small pieces, each one setting off the same cold recognition. He slipped a few into his coat pocket, his hands trembling slightly despite the chill. The rest he left undisturbed, closing the stove door as quietly as if someone were sleeping in the next room. Standing there, he felt the weight of the moment press down on him. For over 2 decades, he had come to these hills looking for a trace, any trace, of his daughter. Now, in the most ordinary corner of the most familiar cabin, he might have been holding it in his hand. On the walk back, the snow was patchy, revealing frozen earth beneath. His pace was slow, not because of the terrain, but because every step carried a new question. If these were bones, how long had they been there? Who had brought them? And why here, in this stove, in this cabin he had checked so many times before? The dread that had settled on him during that first storm visit was now something sharper, a sense that the boundary between searching and finding had just been crossed, and that whatever came next would not be easy to face. By the time he reached home, the fragments in his pocket felt impossibly heavy. He set them on the kitchen table, staring at them in the dim light. They were so small, so fragile, yet they might hold the answer to the question that had haunted his family for 22 years. And if they did, they would also raise another, one he had feared more than any other, whether the truth, when it finally surfaced, would be more than he could bear. Matthew didn't wait more than a day before bringing the fragments to the county sheriff's office. He'd barely slept since finding them, pacing the floor, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. He carried them in a sealed plastic container, a former food tub washed and dried, lined with a folded kitchen towel. The drive into town felt longer than usual, every bend in the road marked by the awareness that what he was holding might finally answer the question that had hollowed out his life for more than 2 decades. At the sheriff's office, the deputy on duty looked at the container, then at Matthew, with the kind of weary caution small-town law enforcement often reserves for long, cold cases. They'd been through false starts before, Supposed sightings, unconfirmed items, vague stories told by people who'd heard something from someone else. The deputy said they'd have the evidence tech take a look, but Matthew could tell from his voice that skepticism was already in the air. Still, the fragments were logged, photographed, and sealed in proper bags before being sent to the state crime lab for analysis. The process felt painfully slow. Weeks passed with no word. Matthew tried to keep himself busy, but the waiting gnawed at him. He went back to the cabin twice, careful not to disturb anything else, just standing in the doorway as if the walls might reveal more. On the 23rd day after he'd turned in the fragments, the call came. The voice on the line was more serious than the one that had taken his report. The state lab had finished its preliminary work. The fragments were bone, human bone, and not just that. They were consistent with a juvenile female, roughly the size and developmental stage Lila would have been at 12 years old. For a moment, Matthew couldn't process the words. He had imagined this outcome in every possible form, but hearing it confirmed left him frozen, gripping the phone as if the connection might break. The deputy's tone was measured, clinical. They explained that the bones were too degraded for DNA extraction from the material tested so far. The intense heat of the stove had destroyed most of the genetic markers, but their morphology and composition were clear enough for classification. In the absence of other missing juvenile females in the county during that period, the implication was devastatingly direct. The next morning, the sheriff's office moved quickly. The cabin was declared a potential crime scene. Yellow tape was strung across the doorway, the sagging walls now a perimeter to be guarded. A forensics team arrived from the state capitol, their vehicles crunching over the frozen dirt. Inside, every inch was photographed. The walls, the floorboards, the stove from multiple angles. The ash pit was emptied entirely and its contents sifted, every fragment collected, bagged, and labeled. Soil samples were taken from beneath the floor in case seepage or residue had settled there over time. Even the woodpile was examined, the ends of the logs checked for transfer or staining. The stove itself was dismantled. The interior walls of its firebox bore signs of repeated high heat burns, far more intense than what would be expected from ordinary cabin fires. One investigator explained quietly to Matthew that such heat could reduce small bones to fragments in just a few hours, but it would take deliberate tending, multiple feedings of fuel, and a conscious decision to keep it burning. That detail lodged in Matthew's chest like a stone. If this had been an accident, if his daughter had died out in the hills and someone had simply found her, why go to such lengths? Outside the cabin, the team widened their search, walking transects into the surrounding brush. Metal detectors swept the ground for small personal effects, buttons, jewelry clasps, zippers, anything that might have survived fire or weather. A few warped metal objects were recovered, but their shapes were too distorted to identify on sight. Everything went into evidence bags. The shift in the case was immediate and profound. For 22 years, the disappearance of Lila Harper had been filed, at least in official language, under missing person, presumed deceased. Now, it was being investigated as a homicide, and not just a homicide, but one involving the destruction of a body to conceal a crime. The sheriff held a closed-door briefing with his deputies, reopening the old interview logs and background checks. Everyone who had been in or near those hills in late October 2001 was back on the table. Names that had faded into rumor, Elijah Crow, the reclusive trapper, the seasonal ranch hand, the solitary miner, were underlined again in red. For Matthew, the vindication was a bitter one. He had always believed his daughter's disappearance wasn't an accident, and now there was physical evidence to support that belief. But holding that evidence in his hand, knowing what it likely was, also forced him to confront the reality he'd never been able to fully admit. Lila had not survived that day. The part of him that had kept her room untouched, that had imagined her walking through the door after all these years, was now cornered by the weight of forensic fact. The news moved through the community in waves. Some reacted with shock, others with a quiet confirmation that they had suspected as much all along. Old fears resurfaced. People remembered the search parties, the whispers about strangers in the hills, the odd details that had never fit neatly into any explanation. The stove, once just a rusting relic in an abandoned cabin, became a symbol in the local conversation, a grim landmark. Detectives cautioned that without a complete skeleton and without DNA, the case would still be difficult to prosecute. The remains could be tied to age and sex, but not yet definitively to Lila. Still, the circumstantial weight was heavy, especially given the absence of any other missing juvenile in the county over the last half-century. Investigators were confident that someone had used that cabin stove to destroy evidence and that the timing was no coincidence. Matthew attended the scene on the last day of the forensic sweep, standing outside the taped-off doorway as the team packed their equipment. The stove, now dismantled, sat on a flatbed truck, every piece tagged and sealed. He stared at it, thinking of the countless times he'd walked past that very spot, sat in that very cabin, without knowing that the answer had been there all along. The Hills had kept their secret until now, and even in revealing part of it, they had offered no clear face, no name, no motive. Just fragments, ash, and a question that had only grown sharper. Who had been inside that cabin all those years ago, and why had Lila's life ended there? When the trucks pulled away, the cabin stood emptied, its silence deeper than before. The crime scene tape fluttered in the cold wind, marking it not as a ruin of time, but as the center of a long-buried act. For Matthew, the search had shifted forever. He was no longer looking for signs of where she might be. Now, he was hunting for the person who had stood in front of that stove, feeding it fuel and watching the smoke rise into the same hills that had watched him search for her for 22 years. Detectives began their next phase of the investigation by tracing the cabin's ownership. In the county's worn property records, tucked between land transfer deeds for cattle pastures and timber plots, they found the name Elijah Crow. Crow had purchased the cabin and the small patch of land it sat on in the late 1980s, listing a post office box instead of a physical address. In a community where most people knew their neighbors by name, Crow's preference for isolation was notable. He lived on the fringe in more ways than one, sometimes seen in town trading pelts for supplies, sometimes disappearing for months into the backcountry with only his traps and his rifle. When investigators began asking around, memories of Crow came back with a mixture of unease and speculation. Several older residents recalled his unpredictable temper. He could be pleasant in short bursts, even charming in a gruff way, but his mood could shift without warning. He was known to keep to himself, but he had an odd habit that lingered in people's minds, inviting local kids to help with chores at his property. Some of these invitations were brushed off as harmless eccentricity. Others struck parents as strange enough to warn their children to steer clear. Back in 2001, when Lila vanished, his name had surfaced early as someone worth looking into. Deputies had questioned him briefly. He claimed he hadn't been anywhere near the Harperland that day, and with no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses, and no history of documented offenses, the trail had gone no further. Now, more than 2 decades later, the discovery in the stove pulled his name sharply back into focus. The timeline was impossible to ignore. According to county records, Crow had abruptly sold the cabin and the surrounding parcel in late November 2001, barely a month after Lila's disappearance. The sale price was far below market value, and the buyer, a shell name attached to a P.O. box, never officially transferred the deed to another owner. From that point on, the cabin simply sat in a legal limbo, unclaimed yet still standing. Detectives noted that this meant anyone could have used it without technically trespassing, especially in such an isolated spot. Digging deeper, they found that Crow had left Montana shortly after the sale, resurfacing in a small town in Idaho where he lived quietly until his death in 2010. Local records there listed no criminal charges, no police reports, nothing that suggested violence. But for investigators in Montana, the lack of a paper trail didn't erase the questions. Why had he left so suddenly? Why sell the cabin for so little? And why had it been his stove, in his cabin, where human bone fragments were now found? The sheriff's office sent detectives to Idaho to speak with anyone who had known Crow in his final years. The picture they gathered was consistent with his Montana reputation, a man who kept mostly to himself, who worked odd jobs when he needed money, and who had no close family. A neighbor remembered him talking about Montana once, saying he'd left because things got too noisy up there, though he never explained what that meant. Another recalled that Crow seemed to burn fires in his stove almost obsessively in winter, tending them through the night. The most frustrating discovery for detectives was that Crow had died of a heart attack at home, leaving behind no journal, no confession, and no clear link to Lila beyond the circumstantial weight of the cabin and its stove. Without the ability to interview him, every suspicion remained untested, every theory speculative. His death effectively sealed off one branch of the investigation. Back in Montana, the team revisited the cabin's history after 2001. If Crow had sold the property and moved away, who had been using it in the years since? The lack of formal ownership made the question nearly impossible to answer. Hunters sometimes passed through. Transients were known to shelter in empty structures during storms. Locals occasionally cut through the area without leaving much sign. Any one of them, or more than one, could have used the stove at some point over 2 decades. The ash pit, while containing burned bone, also held traces of more recent fires, further muddying the timeline. Forensic experts explained that without a tightly controlled context, it would be almost impossible to determine exactly when the bones had been burned. This ambiguity kept the investigation from closing in on any single suspect. For some in the department, the simplest explanation was still the most compelling: that Crow, for reasons unknown, had been involved in Lila's disappearance and had used his stove to dispose of her remains before leaving Montana. For others, the gaps in the timeline left too much room for another scenario: that someone else had brought the remains there later, taking advantage of an abandoned cabin with a stove capable of destroying evidence. For Matthew Harper, the reappearance of Crow's name was both a spark of hope and a source of deep frustration. He remembered the man from years earlier, the way his eyes had darted when deputies had first questioned him, the stories neighbors told about his temper. But knowing Crow was dead meant knowing that if he had been responsible, he had carried the truth with him to the grave. Matthew also couldn't let go of the possibility that Crow had nothing to do with it, that the real person, the one who had taken his daughter, was still alive. The cabin itself remained sealed as an active crime scene for weeks. Investigators collected anything that might bear a fingerprint or trace DNA: the handle of the stove, the doorknob, the remains of glass jars on a shelf. Most items came back with either no viable prints or ones too degraded to match. The few usable samples belonged to a scattered mix of individuals, likely the byproduct of decades of passing traffic. None matched anyone in the criminal database. When the tape finally came down, the cabin stood once more in its isolation, wind pushing through the cracks in the boards. The stove was gone, now locked in an evidence facility miles away. For the community, the reopening of the case had reignited old anxieties. People who had stopped locking their doors at night began locking them again. Parents who had grown up hearing about Lila's disappearance now told the story to their own children, cautioning them about wandering too far. In the sheriff's office, the case file thickened again with new interviews, photographs, and lab reports. Yet the essential questions, who, when, and why, remained unanswered. The presence of human remains in Crow's stove had transformed the disappearance from a haunting mystery into a confirmed act of violence. But whether Elijah Crow had been the one to commit it, or whether he had simply left behind a place where someone else could finish a terrible act, was a truth that seemed to recede further each time they reached for it. And so the investigation stood at a crossroads, caught between the shadow of a dead man and the possibility of a living one, somewhere out there, who had once stood in that cabin and fed the fire. The results from the forensic lab, though conclusive in identifying the fragments as human and likely belonging to a juvenile female, left one critical question unanswered: when had they been burned? The extreme heat of the cabin stove had obliterated most of the microscopic structures that could have provided a definitive timeline. Without those markers, analysts could only offer a frustratingly broad range, anywhere from weeks to decades before the fragments were recovered. This meant that the bones could have been destroyed in the immediate aftermath of Lila's disappearance, or they could have been hidden somewhere for years before finally being burned. The ambiguity opened the door to competing theories, and each one carried its own disturbing implications. For some investigators, the simplest answer still carried the most weight. They believed Elijah Crowe had been involved from the start, that he either lured or encountered Lila on the day she vanished, killed her, and used his stove to destroy the evidence before quietly selling his property and leaving Montana. His abrupt departure, his known temper, and his history of interacting with children in ways some found unsettling all fit the outline of a suspect with both motive and opportunity. The fact that the stove was his, that it had sat in his cabin at the time she disappeared, was, to these detectives, more than coincidence. But others in the department couldn't overlook the holes in that theory. Crowe had been questioned in 2001, and nothing at the time connected him to the crime scene. More importantly, the cabin had sat in a kind of legal and physical limbo after he left, its ownership unclaimed, its doors unlocked. Over the years, hunters, squatters, and passers-by could have come and gone without leaving a trace. If someone else had gained access long after Lila's disappearance, someone who had been holding her remains somewhere hidden, they could have used the stove as a final disposal point, taking advantage of its isolation and destructive power. In that version of events, Crowe's role might have been nothing more than providing the setting, without ever knowing what happened there years later. The difference between those two theories was everything. In one, the man most people already suspected was the killer. In the other, the real perpetrator was still out there, possibly watching as the investigation circled an already dead man. The problem was, the evidence didn't lean clearly in either direction. The heat that had destroyed so much of the bone structure had also erased the ability to tie the act to a specific moment in time. For the Harpers, this uncertainty was its own kind of torment. The discovery in the stove had answered the question they had lived with for 22 years, whether Lila was still alive. But it had done so without offering the dignity of knowing how she had died or at whose hands. Matthew found himself caught between gratitude for finally having something tangible and rage at the fact that it still wasn't enough. Sarah, quieter in her grief, avoided talking about the stove at all, focusing instead on what little they could do to give their daughter a proper place to rest. In town, the rumors began almost immediately. News of the stove and the bone fragments spread quickly, despite the sheriff's efforts to keep certain details from the public. Some residents were convinced it had been Crowe and that the case, for all practical purposes, was solved. Others leaned toward the second theory, convinced that the real killer was someone still living among them. Conversations in the diner took on a sharper edge. Old grudges were dredged up with people questioning alibis that had gone unchallenged for decades. Names were whispered. A rancher who had been drinking heavily in those years and sometimes disappeared for days. A seasonal worker who had left town abruptly the following spring. Even a retired logger who'd once been seen near the cabins without any clear reason for being there. Each name brought its own string of half-remembered stories, each one weaving into the larger web of speculation that had surrounded the case from the beginning. The sheriff's office, already cautious about chasing dead ends, found themselves fielding calls about sightings and suspicions that ranged from barely plausible to outright fantastical. Meanwhile, detectives continued to revisit the physical evidence, hoping for some overlooked lead. The ash from the stove yielded nothing beyond the bone fragments. No fibers, no trace metals from personal items, no accelerants that might have indicated a deliberate attempt to increase the fire's intensity. The soil beneath the cabin floor revealed old organic material, but nothing that could be tied to human remains. Even the stove itself, now stored in a secure facility, offered no usable fingerprints. It was a trove of implication without a single thread to pull toward certainty. Some members of the investigative team began to explore the possibility that the remains hadn't been burned in their entirety at the cabin. Perhaps they had been partially destroyed elsewhere, then moved there to finish the process. This would explain the lack of associated debris, no clothing fasteners, no metal from jewelry or zippers, and would suggest an even more deliberate effort to erase all trace of the victim. But again, without a timeline, this was only conjecture. The stalemate began to weigh on everyone involved. For the Harpers, the initial surge of attention following the discovery gave way to the familiar quiet of waiting. For the sheriff's department, each passing week without a new break made it harder to justify the allocation of resources. And for the town, the case became a mirror of its own divisions, those who believed the story had reached its grim conclusion, and those who believed it was still unfolding. Matthew, unwilling to let the momentum die, began making his own quiet inquiries again, much as he had in the early years. He spoke to hunters who had used the hills in the past decade, to ranch hands who had camped in the old cabins, to anyone who might have noticed someone spending unusual amounts of time there. Most had nothing useful to offer, but a few hinted at things that stuck with him. A campfire spotted on the ridge one winter night, a pickup truck parked on the old logging road weeks before the stove discovery. None of it was specific enough to act on, but all of it fed the part of him that couldn't stop piecing together possibilities. By the time summer rolled around, the investigation was once again hovering between activity and dormancy. The stove remained in evidence, the fragments in the custody of the state lab. The case file had grown thick again, but the center of it, the truth about who had taken Lila and why, was still empty. And so, the town settled into its uneasy equilibrium, living alongside the absence just as it had before, only now with the knowledge that the end of Lila's life had not been a quiet fading into the hills, but something deliberate, concealed, and irreversible. For the Harpers, this knowledge was both a cruel ending and a cruel continuation, proof she was gone, but no clear picture of how or why, and no one to hold accountable. In that way, the discovery in the stove had changed everything and nothing all at once, leaving them exactly where they had been for 22 years, staring into a space where the truth should be, and finding only the dark outline of what might have happened. Matthew Harper stood in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom, his hand resting on the frame as though the wood itself might steady him. The room was exactly as it had been the last day she slept in it, 22 years earlier. A thin layer of dust clung to the windowsill, but the quilt on her bed was still neatly folded at the foot, the colors faded from years without sunlight. A shelf of paperbacks leaned slightly to one side, their spines creased from her small hands turning the pages. On the hook by the door hung her winter coat, sleeves still bent at the elbow, as if she might reach for it at any moment. For decades he had refused to linger here, walking past with the door half closed, telling himself that keeping it untouched meant keeping a place for her return. Now he stepped inside, knowing she would never walk back through the door. The sheriff's office had called 2 days earlier. The bone fragments were being released to the family. The state lab had completed every test they could perform, and the official report was blunt. Human remains consistent with a juvenile female, age and size matching that of Lila Harper. Without DNA, they could not confirm their absolute identity, but there was no other missing girl from that time, no other family waiting for an answer. This was hers. It had to be. The funeral home handled the transfer quietly. There was no casket, only a small sealed urn containing what could be collected from the stove and the ash pit beneath it. It sat on the table in Matthew's kitchen for a night, a simple ceramic container holding the sum of what was left of his daughter. Sarah ran her hand over it without speaking, her thumb tracing the cool surface as if memorizing it. The next morning, they carried it to the cemetery, where an empty headstone had stood for more than a decade. The burial was as private as the day was still. Just Matthew, Sarah, their 2 surviving children, and the pastor who had married them 30 years before. The hole dug beside the headstone seemed too small to hold anything of consequence, yet it swallowed the urn with the same quiet finality as any grave. Sarah knelt to touch the top of the stone, her lips moving in words only she could hear. Matthew stayed standing, his gaze fixed on the trees beyond the fence, the same hills where she had vanished. The pastor said a few lines about closure, about rest, about the return of what was lost. But to Matthew the words didn't feel true. They hadn't brought her home. They'd buried what was left of her. But the rest, the why, the how, the who, was still out there. Later that week, the sheriff stood behind a podium in the county building, television cameras from the nearest city positioned at the back of the room. He read from a prepared statement. The remains recovered from the cabin stove had been analyzed and were believed to be those of Lila Harper, missing since October 2001. The case, he said, was resolved in part. The official cause of death could not be determined, and the manner of death would remain classified as undetermined, pending further evidence. The investigation into the circumstances of her disappearance and death remained open. The sheriff's voice was steady, but his words landed like stones, a resolution that was not resolution at all, a truth that answered one question while leaving every other one untouched. Reporters asked the questions everyone expected. Did they believe Elijah Crow was responsible? Could the remains have been placed in the stove years after Lila's disappearance? Were there any active suspects? The sheriff answered in careful, measured phrases, avoiding definitive statements. Crow remained a person of interest, but he was deceased. The possibility that someone else used the cabin after his departure could not be ruled out. Evidence was still being processed, leads were still being pursued. Nothing in his voice suggested he believed an arrest was coming soon. For the Harpers, the press conference confirmed what they had feared. There would be no one in handcuffs, no trial, no moment in a courtroom where they could look at the person who had taken her and hear them speak the truth. All they had now was the knowledge that her final moments had likely been in those dark hills, and that she had been alone when they came. That fact was both a comfort and a torment. Comfort in knowing she hadn't been taken far, torment in imagining her waiting for someone to find her who never came. The stove, now dismantled, was transported to the state evidence facility. The heavy iron panels were tagged, photographed, and stored in a climate-controlled room, each piece numbered and recorded. For the investigators, it was an exhibit, a repository of physical data. For Matthew, it was something else entirely, an iron tomb that had held the last trace of his daughter. He had seen it lifted out of the cabin, its weight bending the straps, the sound of metal on metal as it was lowered onto the truck bed. That image stayed with him more than any photograph or lab report. In town, people adjusted to the news in their own ways. Some spoke of it openly, saying at least the family had something now, at least they knew. Others avoided the topic altogether, unwilling to reopen the old wound. There was no single story to tell, only fragments, just like the evidence itself. Theories continued to move quietly through conversations, that Crow had acted alone, that someone else had used the cabin later, that Lila's death had been a sudden act of violence or a drawn-out ordeal. The stove's presence in the narrative was like a shadow, impossible to ignore, impossible to see fully. Matthew visited the cabin site one last time before the sheriff's office removed the tape. Without the stove, the place felt gutted. The corner where it had stood was marked by a square of darker floorboards, and the air smelled faintly of ash, even after weeks of being open to the wind. He stood there for a long time, imagining the fire that had burned so hot it could erase almost everything. He imagined someone standing in front of it, feeding it fuel, knowing what they were doing, watching the smoke rise into the cold night air. He knew it might have been Crow, it might have been someone else, but whoever it was had stood in this exact spot, and they had left without a trace. When he finally turned to leave, he didn't look back. The hills were quiet, the snow just beginning to fall in thin, wind-blown flurries. As he walked down the trail, he realized the search that had defined half his life was over in one way and endless in another. The part of him that had gone looking for her every day no longer had a place to go. But the part that needed to know, that needed the whole truth, would never stop moving. Back at home, he passed Lila's room on the way to his own. The door was open now, sunlight falling across the bedspread. He paused for just a moment, then kept walking. Some things he knew would remain untouched, not because he still believed she might come back, but because they were the last pieces of a life that had been taken from them. In that room, in that cabin, in those hills, the answers had been there all along, hidden in plain sight for 22 years, waiting to be found, and still refusing to be fully known.